showtime, folks. And we're going to record something that's called a pilot. And then Crazy Joe Davola comes out. Well, okay, that's getting a little too far ahead of us. That's in part two. Yep, we've made it to the big moment of season 4, where Jerry and George cast and film their pilot to The Jerry Show, which has been, of course, the story arc of the entire season 4. It was definitely a big night for the Seinfeld series, of course, because this, of course, took place also the same night as the finale of Cheers, which was at the prime spot for television, 9 o'clock on Thursday nights. And Seinfeld was basically in front to replace it in the fall for season 5, which they in fact would. This show actually, because before then, the Shoes was the first episode, as I said, that the show was the first one to air after Cheers on 9:30 on Thursdays. This show, since Cheers had their finale at 9, this show aired at 8 o'clock when it first aired. And it had very, very outstanding ratings, very outstanding viewership, and of course, like I said, it was basically the final knockout punch for them to replace Cheers in their time slot in the following fall. And it's a 2-part episode, and it's a pretty good one. I definitely think this is a great finale. Sad, small, a little bit of a sad ending, though, at the end of part 2, but, whatever. It's a show. But anyways, so the episode starts with the same conversation that Larry David, again, had with Kenny Kramer. Kramer is still trying to get Jerry to let him play Kramer in the show. And he's saying, you can't play Kramer because you can't act. And then, of course, the funny thing is, though, is, yeah, Kramer can't act, but really all he has to do is be himself, because he's playing himself in the show. But basically they go back and forth, trying to, pretend to laugh and whatnot, and they're both saying how it's horrible. George even comes in and agrees that it's horrible as well. And then he comes in, but then George is asking Jerry, have he heard from NBC yet? Because he hasn't heard from them yet, so when the casting's going to be. And he's starting to worry that, what if, they're going to be, they're not going to pick up the show now, they're going to just pull the plug on it, which is not the case, because Elaine, again, had saved them from losing the show back at the Shoes after George got caught looking at Dalrymple's daughter. But, of course, they hadn't really heard much from Russell lately. Like, what's going on with him? They cut to a scene at McManus's, I believe it's called. Dalrymple's sitting there, and Elaine comes in. Now, remember, at the end of the Shoes, Elaine basically helped them. Here was the I realized recently. Elaine helped them get the pilot back on track because of, the statement she basically helped them make at Pfeiffer's. But then in the end, she ended up costing them their show also, probably. But Elaine goes to meet Russell, who they had gone on one date with, and Elaine just didn't seem like she was that interested. Russell, however, cannot get her out of his mind, and he pretty much becomes obsessed with her. He said he's been calling her a lot, but she wouldn't call him back. Like Elaine's saying, we went on one date 2 months ago, and he still, is hooked on her. Elaine tells him how, you are the president of NBC. You can have any woman you want. He wants Elaine, though. Elaine tells him, Russell, you are a nice guy, but basically she's trying in the nicest way to tell him that, she's not into him like that. And she uses his job as an excuse, saying she doesn't really like television. She goes, maybe if you work for something like Greenpeace or something, then maybe, that'd be a different story, which, of course, Russell takes that really literally as a little kid. But then he tries telling her about, all the pilots that they have, and he said one of them is a very young comedian, Jerry Seinfeld, which, oddly enough, again, there's a character in the Jerry Show named Elaine Bennis, and back in the Shoes, Elaine said maybe she would mention something to Russell about a couple ideas she had for the script. So you thought back then, he knows that Elaine knows Jerry and George. But now it's like, he doesn't. So, but then because Elaine was like, "Oh yeah, I've heard of him. He does a lot of that. Have you ever noticed this? Have you ever noticed that stuff?" Like again, implying that she's just not into television. But Elaine kept saying, "I don't have time. I gotta get going. I gotta leave for work." And then Russell was just like, will you call me? Well, actually, he also was trying to explain the Jerry show, and even though again Elaine supports it, she acted like she didn't know Jerry. But he basically was saying this, having the same conversation with her that George first had with them when they came to pitch the idea earlier in the series back in the pitch. But Elaine was like, "I'm not into that. I gotta go." Like, well, will you call me again? When we're gonna see each other again? And Elaine's like, "No, not happening." So obviously, this sends Russell into a big depression, unfortunately, and Elaine just finds him as a creeper, basically. Back at the apartment, though, for Jerry's phone rings, and it's for Kramer. Which again, why is he taking calls now there? And then Jerry and George get into some debate about George wearing sweatpants, saying it makes him look lazy and such. And then finally, though, the phone though rings a second time though, and it's NBC. They said they have a scheduled time for the casting session. So like, okay, excellent. Before the casting session, though, George goes to see his therapist, which I'm surprised he was, because the last time we saw her was in the shoes, and George took it personally when she said she didn't think the script was funny. So I was surprised he was still going to see her because of how he took the news she gave him. But basically, George was having the same conversation with her that basically, in some ways, implied how Larry David was. He didn't think the show was going to get picked up. Like he was anxious about the show getting picked up and him being successful and all that jazz. Which the psychiatrist is trying to get him to help her. She's trying to get him to be more confident about it. I think that he'll be a success when he does it. And of course George saying how God didn't put me on this earth to be successful, but she reminds me, I thought you didn't believe in God and all that jazz. But then she notices like something white on George's lip, and it's like some sort of like a discoloration. And she's like, "I get that checked." And you're like, "You think it's something bad?" Like anytime like someone would suggest George go get it checked, it's like, "You think it's something bad?" It's like your jobs are trying to get me to believe that it's not something bad, but you're implying there could be something bad. It's like that they couldn't determine anything. So then, of course, they're in a cab, and again, George freaking out again, showing Jerry the lip, and even as the cab driver, and they're both saying, about getting it checked and whatnot. And like, if you get checked, he says, "If I don't get it checked, then I'll believe there's nothing wrong with me. If I do get checked, then I'll know there's something." And then Jerry basically says, "At least if there is, he may catch it ahead of time." Which again, you couldn't tell George that there was something wrong. There could be something wrong because he was freaking out basically, and he's thinking, "I'm about to be successful, and now God's going to take me with a terminal illness." He's saying basically. But of course, as they're driving though, they drive past, of course, which this finale actually brought back characters from throughout this season, and unfortunately, one of them, who we haven't seen since the opera, is Crazy Joe Davola. They drove past, and he peeks in the window and goes, "Good luck with NBC, Jerry," on the pilot. Obviously showing that he's still, stalking down Jerry and freaking out. So they go to the casting session at NBC, and what I didn't know is I found interesting is they actually brought in actors who, when Seinfeld was originally being casted for, they brought in some people who actually did audition for those roles in real life. I don't have all the names, of course, but there's a few. Like, for example, they brought in Mariska Hargitay, who is very well known for playing Captain Olivia Benson, of course, in SVU, which I'm a huge fan of SVU. Definitely a huge fan of her work, for sure, on SVU. And I actually found out that she originally auditioned for Elaine for real life. I'm like, oh, wow, she would be a good Elaine, I thought. But that was interesting. They only showed one Elaine audition, which was Hargitay. The Elaine character who they casted, which was, the character's name was Sandy Robbins. Well, Mariska Hargitay's character's name was Melissa Shannon. They didn't use the actual actors' names. They actually just, gave them, of course, a different name. But the actors who played them were people who actually auditioned for the parts in real life when Seinfeld was first becoming a thing. They only showed one casting for Elaine, but of course George. The thing that they're trying to apply though, like not everybody, like, NBC and Jerry and George, not all of them were agreeing on the same people. Like there was some people who they were thought were better than that, or there's some people that Jerry liked that George didn't, or George liked Jerry didn't. They didn't. Jerry definitely. Well, Jerry wanted to read with Hargitay because obviously he thought she was beautiful. George though didn't like her because she made some bald comment. But they had one person come in for Elaine, but that wasn't who they casted. They casted the character's name was Sandy Robbins instead. They showed two people for George. One was a guy who was like a little like too enthusiastic. The other one came in was Michael Barth, and George didn't like him though because he said this guy's some type of a loser or something. Of course, obviously the George character is based on George, but they mostly said bring in Kramers, and we saw a bunch of people come in as Kramer. Some kind of had it, some that had the look of Kramer and everything. The guy they ended up picking though, the character's name was Tom Pepper, but the actor Larry Hankin, he actually was also someone who actually originally auditioned for the role of Kramer or Kessler or whatnot. But of course, Jerry was very set on Michael Richards for that role. Or was it Larry David? One of the two was like they were already like instantly they instantly thought Michael Richards for the part whenever they did so. But Kramer, of course, actually auditions for Kramer, but he comes in and says his name's Martin von Nostrad, which of course he used for whenever he was posing as someone else to get that jacket back from his mother's apartment, or who took it from his mother's apartment, or whoever it was. Unfortunately, though, Kramer had to go to the bathroom, like just at the beginning of the audition. But everywhere he went, the bathroom at NBC, at local restaurants, the bathrooms were full, and he had to go very bad. And on the way back, he got mugged. And because he waited so long, it went away. So he claims he got backed up, as he would say. Which very, very, very sucks for him. But also, whenever Tom Pepper came into audition, he asked if he could have some raisins, and George was convinced he left with the box of raisins and stole the raisins. So that came something that George was like completely obsessed with. And then of course later, Jerry and Elaine are talking, and Elaine's asking who's playing Elaine, and some very young talented actress who claims he thinks she's an Eskimo, and all that jazz. But of course, she also asked, did Russell come to the casting? Which Jerry, of course, said no. And then Elaine mentions how she's starting to worry about him because she knows that what happened the other day and how he's like kind of has an obsession for her. But then she also points out that the service at Monk's has not been good since the new owner took over. But then she also notices how all the women have large chests. And she's wondering if that's, if there's only, hiring women, built that way. So she basically said she's going to try to, look into this, basically, as she obsesses over that. Of course, George goes to the doctors, though, and they do a biopsy, which, of course, George is freaking out. He's like, is it cancer? Is it cancer? He's like, well, we won't know unless we do the biopsy. Because, but you think something's wrong with me? You think something's wrong with me? He goes, I don't know. But once again, George wanted them to say, no, you're crazy. There's nothing wrong with you. But, the guy was just scared, basically. And, of course, they had to wait for the test results. And then Kramer, of course, eventually would tell them how he got mugged and, how he got backed up and such. Elaine comes in, and she had said that she was talking to some people, and they agree that that they think it's discrimination. So she's gonna go apply for a job herself and only dress a certain way to show that basically make her look different from the others. And she's gonna prove herself. But then in the meantime, though, also before that happened, TV Elaine, Sandy Robbins, TV Elaine calls Jerry, wants to have dinner with him. They go meet at McMangus, the same place where Dalrymple met Elaine earlier in the episode, and she basically says something, I want to know exactly who this Elaine person is. I want to be exactly like her. She's asking him all these questions, how does she eat a hamburger? How does she eat pasta? And all this other stuff. Her favorite movies and whatnot. But then she's implying more that I want to experience everything that Elaine experienced. She's like, everything? And she's like, everything. Obviously starting to imply that she wants Jerry, basically. And she started asking Jerry stuff how's Elaine during sex and whatnot. Which Elaine he's saying how she likes to talk, and not really much dirty talk, but just chit chat, he claims it's just chit chat, movies, current events and regular stuff, basically. But and obviously, he starts getting a little uncomfortable. He's trying to change the subject. He goes and look at his watch, Sandy, but then she goes Elaine, call me Elaine. And then she asks, how does Elaine kiss? And then before Jerry can explain, she pulls him in and starts kissing him and singing like this. And when it was finished, Jerry says actually she has a thing where she likes to spiral her tongue around. And then Sandy cuts him off and, says like this and does it. And then Jerry's like, I think you got it. But obviously Jerry was very uncomfortable about the whole thing. And obviously, they're supposed to be working together in this show. And then Kramer then meets up with Tom Pepper at Monk's, and he's basically, discussing, how the character's based off of him, and how he basically wants Tom to be exactly like him. But Tom intends on putting his perspective into the character also. But of course, they weren't agreeing on that, basically. Which implies how eventually, they did kind of, do with, Cosmo, with Michael Richards and Kenny Kramer, where yes, the character was based off of Kenny Kramer, but eventually they kind of made Michael Richards' character feel like a little more of his own, while still having a part of Kenny Kramer, basically. Which, like I said, a lot of these, there's a lot of these stories, again, that are just taken after or modified in some way of how it was again, whenever Jerry and Larry were putting together the show originally. But meanwhile, while they're there, Elaine comes in and applies for a job, but then the manager says, I don't think we really need anyone right now, and Elaine takes it as, again, that because of the way she dressed and the way he thought he looked at her, that he was being discriminating. So she went to the Equal Employment Office and such, which was actually the same set used back in the Boyfriend episode when George went to the unemployment office, and basically they were going to investigate. And that's how part one ended. So, there's a lot of things to wonder, how will the show go? Will people get along? Because there's obviously some tensions with, the NBC executives and Jerry and George. They weren't all agreeing on the same, people, the cast. Jerry obviously feels uncomfortable with TV Elaine. Elaine feels uncomfortable with Dalrymple, and also she's now investing in this. What will happen with George's biopsy? Will Kramer be able to, relieve himself again, or will he remain back up? A lot of things going into part 2 of the finale of season 4, which again is the pilot. So, and of course also Crazy Joe Davola is back on the loose again. What will happen there? We'll find out next, guys, as we've completed part 1 of the pilot. Next is part 2 and the finale of season 4 of Seinfeld. Again, the breakthrough season and quite possibly the best season in the series, I will be honest. But guys, that's my thoughts on part 1 of the pilot. What are your thoughts on part 1 of the pilot? Leave your thoughts down in the comment section below. And be sure as always to slap a like on the video and subscribe for more content on my channel. And follow me on Twitter as well at DemandAirboy93. Till then, guys, I'm checking out. I'll catch y'all later. Have a good rest of your day. Get out of here. Okay, good. Peace out, everybody. Yeah, no one will surprise. There's no